and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lumb.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Cardiff Met Sport Coaching Hub podcast. I'm your host for today's session, Mike Castle, and I'm joined today by Dr Charlie Corsby and a new guest, first time on the podcast, Dan Spencer. Do you want to start with a quick intro about yourself, Dan? What do you do here at the university?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for inviting me on today. So my current role is a lecturer in sport coaching, and I've been doing that for about 4 years now, starting as part-time staff and recently moved in full-time staff following the completion of my doctorate about 6 months ago now. I started as an undergrad, started on our sport and PE course back in 2011 and kind of made a journey through from PE into performance analysis, which was something that really interested me at the time at master's level. But towards the end of that, it was actually more so related to coaching that really interested me. And so that's what led me into my doctoral studies and my work since then.
So let me ask, why the switch back to sport coaching or back to that field that's perhaps a little bit more pedagogical? Because you and I have got quite similar backgrounds in that we've both done a master's in performance analysis, gone to the dark arts, so to speak, and then we've been sort of sold by the taught doc. What was it about that program and what was it about coaching that you really wanted to come back to?
I guess as a 19, 20-year-old, I got captured by the snazzle and dazzle of all the technology, the kind of the sciencey side of things, which looks on the outside pretty good. It's not to say that it's not worthwhile, and I think it's definitely got a really solid place within performance sport, and done properly, it's really useful. But it just wasn't what I was after. It was really getting into the kind of the interaction of sport, of coaching. That's the stuff that really interests me. Working with people on an individual level, working with teams, working with groups. I just felt as an analyst, I felt slightly detached from that. Often you're analysing, recording video from a gantry. You're then sat behind a computer, analysing clips. And yes, you get some level of interaction, which I think should be more so for an analyst. And I think that is becoming increasingly more so within the field, that analysts have a much more central role as to what they do within a coaching setup. But it still just wasn't enough for me. I really wanted to get my hands dirty on the side of the pitch, on the pitch, getting muddy, getting wet, and really working with athletes on a kind of personal level.
Yeah. And was there anything about your playing background? Tell us a little bit about your playing background. Of course, a very successful footballer, but was there anything about that journey as a player that was linked with the performance analysis that you felt a little bit sort of dissatisfied with, and that's why the move? Or
yeah, I mean, very successful is probably a bit of an overstatement, but a modest career, shall we say. Yeah, I suppose that's probably another side of it. It's coming from that playing background, having played at the university for a number of years and been part of the journey of the club moving from the lower leagues of domestic Welsh football, fortunately enough for us and for me, right the way through to Europa League. So I guess seeing that journey of the influence you can have over a group of people was something that definitely attracted me towards coaching. And I guess something that unfortunately you don't quite get as just being an analyst, or not just being an analyst, but having a more central role as a coach, I suppose.
Great. And that, I suppose that academic journey has led to positions in teaching at the university as well. Tell us a little bit about the positions that you've held.
Yeah, so I guess given that diversity of academic background, having had a master's in performance analysis and coaching, I've actually taught, or as I started my teaching career, teaching on both, which was also interesting, seeing different groups of different student groups, different cohorts, understanding different types of student, understanding different ways of teaching as well. And eventually what that's led to is I now lead on a module on the performance analysis program, which is a development of an old coaching module that the performance analyst students used to do, but it's something that's made now more applicable for performance analysis students. So the juncture, what I see between analysis and coaching, is video-based feedback. And so I think that kind of setting, that kind of learning opportunity is kind of sits in between coaches and analysts, and sometimes isn't paid enough attention. So I'm working really hard with the level 4 students on our analyst course to think more carefully about what we do in those sessions, having influence on the way that are facilitated, not just an opportunity just to dump feedback on players. This is what we did well, this is what we didn't do so well, but really as opportunities for players to start problem solving, thinking about what it is that they are doing without necessarily just being told, because we always have the age-old adage of you've only got a player's attention for 10 minutes and then they switch off. Or for me, sometimes I think if we think more carefully about how that information is delivered or facilitated, then we might be able to gain that attention for longer. It's no wonder if you're going to lecture somebody telling them how bad they are for an hour, there's no wonder they switch off. So trying to get them more involved is definitely something that is what we're working on in that module for sure.
And how much of that module has taken inspiration in terms of content or delivery from the project that we're going to talk about today that you've been doing?
I guess that juncture is partly where the project idea started from, or at least part of the journey started. It's evolved quite a lot since then. I think from those early discussions that we're having with supervisors, to mention Charlie was my supervisor, along with Robin Jones. And yeah, we started from something along those lines, but it definitely emerged and developed quite considerably.
So there's probably apt time to jump over to the man that needs no introduction. But Charlie, your role on this project, why was it that you had a bit of an interest in this project, and that helped you to sort of go, yeah, okay, I want to go and supervise that one and support Spain and support the ideas?
Yeah, I think the actual origins of the project, there's probably a couple of different strands to the story that we could tell. I think one of those strands in particular comes from the conversations that Dan and I were having about practice. We've worked in the same environments as players, as coaches for a long time as well, so we have a lot of coaching conversations, if you like. And one of those conversations was inevitably stemmed around performance analysis, and thinking about the role of performance analysis, how we're preparing students who are performance analysts, how they're then being used within the environment, particularly within the work that we do within the academy, how we have particular placements, how we can better harness some of the work that they do. And then probably some more kind of interesting topics as well in terms of the actual practice of performance analysis, thinking about operational definitions. How do we arrive at some of those? What do they look like in practice? How does that then come out in terms of coding some of the actual practices of the analyst, and how that then links to coaching practice in and of itself? So we were really, inevitably we were having lots of those conversations anyway. So I think there's kind of one story there that links to the project. But there's a much wider story that actually I think Dan's done an excellent job of picking up, which is one around language. And again, we were, as a part of some of those conversations around operational definitions, it's just a site of which we can then talk about language use. And that's really where I think the ideas to actually create a project came from, and we were kind of umming and ahhing over some coffees as to what that would look like. And I think inevitably it was quite an organic process in terms of arriving at a project. And it wasn't so much like I had an idea and here you go, Dan, you go and explore this. And it wasn't vice versa either. It wasn't Dan had a particular idea that he definitely wanted to explore and then asked me to help, or Robin to help. It was much more kind of iterative in the process. And I think there's also a really clear tie to the some of the work that I've done previously as well around observation. These are some of the things that we're talking about that's perhaps critical of maybe the way that one, observation's positioned within the literature, and then two, how that then ties into what an analyst is doing in terms of trying to capture some observation, and what was the actual practices that are being done by those who are doing that work. So that was kind of the more general insight. And inevitably, like all good projects, they come out of an idea and they take lots of different angles and lots of different ways. And I think that's probably reflective in that there wasn't a particular origin to this project or to Dan's work and the way he's taking it, but actually it's kind of a combination of lots of different things, which I think is really interesting. Listening back to Dan's history, I think that's really evident in the project and the way he thinks and the way he's critical of certain ideas as well, which is good. It's a really good example of using your history to inform where you're taking future projects.
The project itself, and we'll get into the nitty gritty of it in a moment, is based in a rugby union context. But I seem to remember on the DSC you doing some action research in football and the language that's used in football. So how much did that inform? Sort of, is that when you first sort of got a bit of a grab at some of these concepts and you wanted to take them further? I guess
this is where different parts of the story, of the different elements of the project coming together, really start to meet. I had started to read stuff around language use, touching on some philosophy of language, which we won't get stuck into today, but coupled with the idea of actually kind of video-based feedback sessions where lots of discussion takes place, the ideas, stuff around operational definitions. And so, yeah, I guess that's the kind of juncture between them all. And that really is kind of two what felt like disparate ideas, but I realized that they met in the sense that much of what coaches do involves talking to, explaining, defining, reviewing, discussing, making sense of action and making sense of performance in some way or another. And so I felt like, whilst, again, video-based feedback is a phenomenon in and of itself, it's also an excellent site for kind of linguistic interaction. Like, that's where we really start to discuss things, pick things apart, try to decide on what's good, what's bad, things that we've done well, but also in doing so, I guess, come to give meaning to some of the tactics, the strategies, the instructions that are given prior to a game. So it's definitely a swirl of lots of things going on at a certain time. So yeah, I guess that's the other influence that came into this, and probably a more fundamental aspect of the other things that we're touching on within analysis, really related to the language that coaches use in various different sites of interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I remember that action research project that you did, because it did quite a lot for me in my tennis, because I think the terminology or the language you were talking about was defensive in football and getting tight to a player, and how that means different things in different contexts, etc. And I find myself all the time talking to my tennis players about getting tight to the baseline. Well, getting tight to the baseline is very different if you're in like this aggressive mindset or if you're a bit more defensive, passive, etc. So some really interesting stuff. So reading a bit more about your thesis really kind of, I know there's some really interesting takeaways for coaches. I found a huge amount of benefit there. So we'll get into some more of that a little bit later. So we've talked a little bit about the inception of the project. Why don't you give us a little bit more of a context? What was the project specifically about? Who were you working with? What was the context that you were doing the research in?
So I guess the project focus really was how coaches develop meaning around the language that they use. And I guess meaning comes from not only in the way that things are explained, defined, but then of course how that's actioned within training field practices, how they then relay those messages to players, how players take them on board, try and utilize some of those ideas within what they do on the field. But of course, that inevitably then connects with discussions that happen afterwards. The way that those actions, those instances are reviewed, which I guess serves to supplement meaning in some way or another. So it's definitely a range of different things. Like you've mentioned, the research took place within a rugby union club, a fairly high performing one. It performs in a national league structure, but they weren't professional. It was a semi-pro club, but they were definitely working at a very high elite level, which was really interesting to see. So having been part-time, the club trained twice a week on the field. But there was lots of other interactions that surrounded that, being with analysis sessions themselves, of course, strength and conditioning, which is a big part of rugby, and then the fixtures. What initially drew us to this club in particular was the fairly unique way, I suppose, in which they used analysis. So rather than just having team meetings where the coaches have gone away and done their own analysis and present it in front of the players are then just, I guess, recipients of kind of that information. They also facilitated what's called player review sessions, where players would have an opportunity to go in and review their own footage with the support of an analyst, but away from coaches. So I guess it opened a quite unique opportunity for them to speak more openly and freely about what it is that they were doing on the field. And of course, then what was nice is discuss some of the things that the coaches are trying to implement, because you can have listen to quite fruitful conversations actually of players not having to feel that they should agree necessarily with what it is the coaches were doing, or even that they completely understood, which was quite nice as well. There was some useful conversations there. So that's what really attracted us to them. And I guess what the idea, just to add another layer of context here, is that the coaches would set the players tasks to go away and review certain different aspects of the footage. So they might, for 1 week, given on the stuff that they reviewed, please go away and have a look on our kick chases, for instance, or the way in which our possessions ended. And so there is a specific focus, but it's then down to the players to really generate what it is, how they came to perceive of what they did in the game. The idea then was that, having done that review, that they develop a short presentation which they would then present back to the rest of the group in a following team meeting. So some of those insights of interaction were really interesting, not only because they offered greater discussion around what the things that they were trying to develop in the coaches and in terms of their tactics, but also of how sort of different sites of interaction connected. Player review sessions, team meetings, into on-field training sessions, into matches. It was quite nice to see the thread of people making sense of things, how they developed, etc.
And I'm interested in all those different sites of context. We'll probably go into a bit more detail with that, but bit of a step outside your comfort zone, maybe going into a sporting environment that you're not all that familiar with. How was that?
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. I certainly learnt a lot. It was interesting of really how to position myself in that respect as well. I guess there's a few things to come from it. Firstly, that I have a very novice or modest knowledge base of rugby, which worked in a number of ways, really. Firstly, it kind of limited the opportunity that I had to kind of sit within a particular role. When we talk about a participant observer, I think the participant is spoken very loosely there, because it framed that you're a researcher coming into this setting. This is Dan, he's going to be researching, rather than Dan, he's a coach, but is also going to be doing some researching, because that would have been a pretty hard sell, I think, to try and be a coach within that setting. What that meant, though, is that I could ask lots of questions. I almost become like an apprentice. And so I could ask really basic questions about what the players, the coaches were doing, and almost become kind of naive in that sense. And they were just happy to appease some of those questions, which was brilliant. And I could really get some quite rich data of what it is, how they made sense of things, which is, of course, very useful, of my focus being on kind of the language, the tactics that they were talking about, right to the very basic level that they probably hadn't even thought about things before. They just kind of use this, so taken for granted, some of this stuff. You get so caught up, I guess, in the vocabulary of your sport that you don't tend to think about what things mean. And so having to explain that obviously added that kind of layer of richness, I suppose. On the other side of that, I guess, there was one particular episode that I can think about, and it was in a player review session. And for the first few weeks, I'd kind of just sat on the edge, trying to, I guess for want of a better word, just blend in, hoping that they wouldn't really notice or see me. But at that point, I was sat in the corner of the room, and there was I could see a really good interaction happening on the far side between a group of the forwards. They were kind of reviewing some footage, which became quite heated. And I couldn't quite hear what they were saying. And so I walked over to that part of the room, and I noticed as I walked over, the conversation got quieter. And as I got within earshot of them, they completely stopped talking. And so I thought, oof, that's not a good position to be in, given that much of my research will depend on trying to hear some of that work. But this is where parts of, I guess, of my positionality in some ways work together, is that I wanted to give over that I'm not here to scrutinize what you're doing. I'm not here to report back to the coaches. I am just here to understand what it is. And I guess using those kind of naive questions to begin with, just to ask what it is that you're doing, kind of settled them slightly, kind of changed my position, not as somebody as being superior in any way. I'm not an expert here. I'm not trying to scrutinize you, but I'm actually just really want to know. And so those kind of worked in favour, kind of in tandem.
It just sounds so familiar to when you teach it. You're in a, you're in a seminar and you walk around the classroom and they get quieter as you move around. It's like, it's like a shark in a school of fish. They just keep dispersing and things like that. And then you can just ask the most simple of question, but because it's your voice, everyone stops and everyone's like, oh, must be something important coming from that particular voice. That's interesting. So it's similar for you though, Charlie, because you're supervising a project, again, that's not within your sporting backgrounds. I've been a rugby player as far as I know. Unless there's some second life you've got going on.
I would be an absolutely useless.
I'm not sure your knees would cope, in fairness. But how was that for you, I suppose, trying to, supervise and support Dan in a project that's, again, in a context that's outside of your comfort zone?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, actually, because one of the things that when I think back around talking about the project, talking about the data collection in particular, is this is a coaching project. So even though the setting, there might be context-specific things in the setting, for instance, the type of language that's being used in the rugby setting, okay, I would not be familiar with it. And Dan, as the project went on, made an effort to become more familiar with it. But it wasn't necessarily what we were used to, but actually the practices that you're talking about and what the people were actually doing in those settings was really familiar. And so in that sense, although it was rugby was the sport, the coaching had lots of similarities. It looked very, very similar to what we're used to. And so it was really trying to start to think through, well, what are some of the context specific things relevant to the rugby club that was under study, and what are perhaps some of the context-free things that actually, well, these look pretty similar across different settings, and that was where perhaps some of the analysis kind of starts from. Some of the conversations around, well, what are you doing in these particular instances or not? So the example that Dan's just given around walking over, it's not a case of trying to be neutral in this position, but actually is trying to understand what are those practices that those participants are doing. What does that tell you about the setting in and of itself? I.e., if they were in their particular environment, happy to talk about their actions, the way that they played in that kind of safer environment, where it tells you something around what they're doing in that particular setting. So then it then gives you some kind of sensitivity. Okay, what should I be listening for here then? How does this look slightly different? And I think it actually speaks to perhaps some of the findings in itself. It's quite interesting how that incident, from a research method point of view, then also speaks to perhaps some of the findings that Dan will speak about later. The connection between playbook, commonality of language, and then actually craft language in and of itself as well for the players, which like I say, Dan will go on to later, but it's fascinating. So it's really trying to think through some of those instances as opposed to being shocked by, right, I don't know this context, so I can't study it, but it's actually, well, what can I learn from this context that I can then understand based upon what we already know about coaching, and how does this meet the purpose of the project, and how can I contribute to that knowledge, and also what knowledge is already out there that I can lean upon to help me understand what's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. So did your position, did it develop and change over time then? Because you've said, okay, they got a bit quiet to start with. How long were you in the field, and how did your position in relation to the participants change over time?
Yeah, I think naturally it changes as you start to develop relationships with the people that you're studying. They become a lot more comfortable with you being there, used to the sorts of questions that you're asking, the kind of focus of what it is that you're researching, as does your kind of understanding of your research become clearer. I think at the beginning we can sometimes get lost in the amount of things that we should be noting down, but you gradually refine that as the work goes on. And I guess it's important to mention really that this is one of the first times that I'm conducting research in this way as well. And so I'm kind of learning the ropes of how to be a participant observer as I'm going at the same time. So that there was definitely a lot to take in. Sorry, what was the first bit of your question?
Just how did your role change over time in relation to the participants?
Yeah, I guess, the kind of building and forging of relationships with them is really important. Particularly the players, I found, was not more difficult, but it certainly took a bit more time. The fieldwork took place over a period of about 6 months, so the second half of the season. And they're really into the crux of the season as well, so some really important fixtures that were taking place in between each week. And so there was highs, lows, real highs and real lows, really, because they were on the cusp of doing something which they hadn't really done in a number of years. Some weeks we'd come into analysis sessions and the place would be ecstatic. Everybody would be absolutely buzzing about the fixture that had just taken place. Others, they knew they'd missed a really important opportunity, having not performed as well as they thought they could have, and it was really low. So just feeling that and getting a real experience of that was important too.
I think one thing I'd add to that as well, just to the general kind of experience that Dan went through doing the data collection, one thing that I would say that I've seen from a more distant perspective is actually the relationship to the club itself. Having kind of initially you go there, can I do this project with you? They're gatekeepers that you're trying to get access to. Doing the project, the example that had already been mentioned around how players treat you in certain instances, and then actually finishing the project and having something to say about that setting has been quite interesting to see too. And the coaches of this particular environment ended up being extremely receptive to some of the ideas and actually really trying to challenge, right, well, what are we doing and why are we doing certain things? And so it's almost this journey of kind of like Padawan all the way through to master at the end. Because Dan was essentially a master of their environment, even though he wasn't necessarily your traditional participant, but he had something to say about it. And then you kind of see like the full cycle of the research and how the research then starts to inform that practice. I think that's something I'd kind of add to that dynamic as you move through the data collection to analysis, to having something to say about that analysis as well.
And when you had those things to say, were you sort of initially pulled into the conversation and asked for it, or did you feel like even as a researcher you kind of wanted to get involved? You felt like you had something to give that you thought might be of benefit to them, really?
Yeah, I mean, the coaches were very welcome in that respect, in that they saw an opportunity of somebody from a different context, a different sport, to ask what things are like within that sport and kind of how it related to what they were doing, to, I guess, broaden their own perspective, because it's so easy to get caught up in the traditions of a particular sport. And on that front, absolutely. I can remember a real distinct time during a session of just kind of watching things break down rep after rep. I think they were practicing some of their attacking formation, and I could see an issue, and I almost resisted to step in. I, at that point, had a pretty good connection with the head coach, and in the end, I didn't say anything. I was almost going to say to him, "Can I say something here? Can I step in?" Because I felt like I had something to say, and now I wish I had. So I guess when we talk about being a participant observer, the idea is, I guess, you become a participant at the end of the day. And that role, that position definitely changes, as I've mentioned, not only in the relationship that you build, but the kind of status that you have within that group and your purpose there, not merely just to be a researcher, but to kind of contribute in some way. I mean, what better way is there to give back that they've let you in, to have some kind of hopefully positive impact beyond disseminating what you've done afterwards. Yeah. It can evolve as you go through. When you think about traditional ethnography, being part of a particular culture, being part of a social group, that role emerges. You've got to contribute in some way as well. You can't just take all the time. Can you give something back?
So fieldwork lasted 6 months, but are you still contributing in any way as a result of the work? Are you still finding yourself to be somewhat a part of that community, or has it been something that you've been able to leave, I suppose? I
had in the summer, so they were just starting pre-season actually, a good 2-hour debrief really of the research, and a kind of planning session around that as to what that might mean for what they do moving forward. I'm still in fairly regular contact with the head coach, and we have discussions about how those sorts of things are unfolding, how the team's doing, the ways in which the research might inform what they are doing. So I think I wanted to make clear that it wasn't just going to be a clean break, that my research is done, so thank you very much, I've got what I needed, that there is that contribution there, because they're doing, obviously, me a massive, massive favour in helping me to facilitate the research, my PhD. So you have to give back, definitely.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's get into the findings then, because I know that's the stuff that we really want to get into here, because I know there's going to be a huge amount of value for coaches and I suppose anyone involved in any kind of pedagogical practice. You've structured your results in 3 different sort of thematic sections. We've got the playbook, the commonality of language, and craft language. So why don't we start with the playbook then? Can you tell us a little bit about what that theme's all about?
Yeah, I guess just to take a step back really, with the kind of aims of the study being focused on the language that coaches use to kind of develop and coordinate team performance, the focus inevitably becomes on tactics and strategies. And as the project went through, that really became the focus. What are the sort of vocabulary, terminology that coaches are using to inform what players do on the field, basically. So that's where the kind of 3 subheadings emerge from. They're unique in some respect. They overlap quite considerably, but there's definitely unique aspects to each of them. And there's a kind of a distinction definitely between 2 and the other one, as I'll kind of come to demonstrate as we go through. So I guess the idea of the playbook, for instance, will be quite familiar to most people involved in sport. The idea of what a playbook is there to do, the kind of intentions behind it, the way that it's set up, the way that it's explained. And that is really to almost create a choreography of what people do within set-piece performance. And within rugby, of course, that relates to line-outs, scrums, the beginning of a possession, for instance, from a dead ball position, let's say. And then trying to organise and develop sequences of movements of what players do thereafter. The kind of interweaving of players, the lines that they follow, where the ball goes, dummy runs, etc. We can all picture, I guess, the NFL version of things with the zeros and the X's and all the different lines, and it was very much framed akin to that. I guess, given the nature of what that looks like, or at least what it seems, is that it's quite a closed set of skills. Or well, it seems like a closed set of skills. I run here, you run here, we pass here, etc. The different set pieces or the calls falling under the playbook were often explained in a very similar way. They were looking for quite secure definitions of the things that it is, of what they meant by these different terms, these different calls, so to speak. And so that was often reflected in the way that things were explained. This is the call. This is exactly what it looks like through an explicit diagram, let's say, an explicit verbal articulation of what was meant by that. The 12 runs into this gap. The 10 passes behind the 12 to the 13, etc. There was definite emphasis on clarity and being absolutely clear there. There was also things called gold standard demonstrations, where the coaches on the field of play would then isolate players in certain positions and say, right, this is exactly what we mean by this particular call. Look at where everybody's positioned now, walking through. They call them walkthroughs sometimes as well, as to where the ball should go. So that was the kind of emphasis of the playbook, that it was set-piece performance and it was defined in absolute terms, that this is exactly what we mean. I guess a kind of contradiction, or at least a tension, emerged in the way that was explained as to how it was then performed on the field. Because although it felt like these set pieces happened in a kind of closed off space, in that we can run these exactly how we envisage them, their kind of application in the game depended dramatically on the specific situation. So you mentioned earlier about what tight to the baseline means in certain aspects of the games, and it was certainly the case with each of these set pieces, that sometimes they were within the opposition's 22, higher up within the field. Sometimes we were losing on the scoreboard. Sometimes we were trying to protect a score. Different times of the game, the opposition were positioned in slightly different positions to what we expect them to be. And so actually the production of these set pieces changed dramatically. But that came into conflict sometimes with how the set pieces were defined, explained, demonstrated even within their training and within their analysis sessions. And I've got a couple of instances really from the data where that was really evident. There was one training sessions where the forwards were working on their line out performances. They're working through a range of different calls, let's say. It was split into the starting 15 or the starting pack of forwards, and then a reserve pack of forwards, and the starting pack of forwards run through a line out call, and it just seamless. They got into a huddle before, they decided what they were going to do, they set up, they threw the ball, it went down, went out to the backs perfectly. The second pack, shall we say, did the same. They got into the call, decided what it was they were going to do. The line out was thrown, the ball went right over the top, and suddenly a squabble kind of kicked off between a couple of the players. And I remember one player saying, well, no, this is exactly where you've got to be. You're supposed to be here. And one of the other players then saying, well, no, because the opposition moved to their left slightly, so I need to change my position. And it meant that they missed the lift to be able to catch the ball. And it just really captured what it was that I was starting to see, that actually that this one player had a real firm idea according to the explicit definition of what the term was meant to mean, whereas the other one was thinking, okay, I need to change, I need to be adaptive here. And so there was a bit of a tension there between the definition, the explanation on the one hand, and how the game actually unfolded on the other.
So how much of that was down to understanding of the playbook versus the context sort of interfering with how they thought they needed to apply that understanding? Was there a bit of a balance between the two, or was it more predominantly one than the other? Or
I guess that's the difficulty, isn't it? You might say that the squabble between the two players, the one player that's saying, no, this is where you should be, is in one instance saying that they've got a clear understanding of what's supposed to happen. On the other hand, the player wasn't where that player thought he was supposed to be, but they were adaptive. So that's where the conflict was, that the coaches or the players were searching for this real secure sense of what this thing is supposed to mean, this kind of one-dimensional view. This is the call. This is exactly what it meant to be, which is understandable given that we need to try to be clear. But at the same time, actually, there needs to be a sense of we need to make sure this is contextualized to the situation that unfolds.
Yeah, because I read excerpts of your field notes and players sort of talking to each other saying, how's that my fault? It's not my fault. And I'm just, memories flashing up of when I'm working with doubles players, positioning absolutely everything on a tennis court for dubs. Just making sure that you understand, okay, my partner's is going to be stood here when the ball's in this area of the court at the other end, which means that I can just look after this particular element of the court, and then all of a sudden the ball goes right between the middle of two players, and we all joke about, it's the corridor of uncertainty or whatever it might be. But they're looking at each other like, no, that was me. No, that was definitely you. You should have been there, etc., etc. And they've got genuine rationales for why they weren't in certain places and why they didn't think it was their ball. So, for instance, if the ball is on the left-hand side of the court and you've got two of your players then at the net, the player that's on the left, they look after the line and they look after the lob. So they've got two roles. And then the player that's cross-court looks after the middle and the angle. And the reason they look after the angle is because a player, so they look after the angle as well, is because a player who's trying to find an angle is working with a shorter distance, so they have to hit the ball slower to get the ball up and down. So they can cover the two of those. But if the ball sits up above the height of the net a little bit, and a guy's got it, or a guy or a girl's got their forehand sort of lifted up, ready to absolutely slaughter the hell out of the ball, all of a sudden that angle is no longer in play, because they're not going to hit the ball that hard through an angle. So it changes the way that players sort of go, okay, well, now I do look after the line, or now I do look after the middle, and players will sort of cross over a little bit. And I always put it down to understanding, sort of, you just don't understand your position. And when I read this, I was like, oh, actually, maybe there's a bit more context to it than this. So I can think about it in a doubles context. Really difficult for me to think about it in an individual, like a one-person context, because it's a little bit more about, okay, one individual, and context is perhaps a little bit less fuzzy, let's say, because it's only one interpretation of where the ball is and what could potentially happen. So how much of this was a challenge because of the team element of it and the fact that there's so many different interpretations, I suppose, of this playbook?
Well, I guess this is when we were talking before we started the podcast, is that team sports definitely magnifies the complexity of the issues that we're talking about, because there are so many different parts to the puzzle, being players on the field at the end of the day. This kind of elusive idea of a shared understanding is really difficult to come to, because what we mean by a shared understanding, particularly within a set piece performance, is actually not everybody understanding the whole thing exactly the same, because otherwise everybody would be doing exactly the same, and we need everybody has an individual role within that. So that is definitely something that is very complex, and hopefully start to come across in the findings.
I think one of the things I'd add to that as well is it really highlights the examples that you're talking about there, really highlight that ambiguity around some of the terms that are being used and the instructions that are being provided, and that we often treat them as if they are really clear. So Dan mentioned that earlier, the idea that the coaches were trying to provide clarity. The playbook in itself is context free in the sense that it has a really clear idea of this is what we should do in these particular scenarios, and you can create that as complex as you like. You could write pages and pages on a playbook. In this scenario we do this, in this scenario we do this, and you can really layer the detail in terms of this playbook, but it's detached from actual practice itself. And that's really one of the kind of the key points that I think Dan's alluding to, and what the thesis actually really tries to pull out is the ways in which this is actually has to be done by people doing it, and so the language has to be brought out through the actions in themselves. And so what we're really highlighting then is to not treat language as if it's this really clear, understandable, defined, unified idea, but actually it's ambiguous, it's contextual, it's moving, it's shifting, it's slippery at times. And actually that's where some of the art is within the coaching, actually recognizing at times where to pull back in terms of explanations, and where to push as well. And this really speaks to some of that kind of ingenuity as well.
I guess to bring back to the tension from the other side of things, is there was a tension between the way that it was explained and that secureness, the difficulty of how contextual the game was, but I guess the frustrations of the players then is that some of the coaches would really come back to those definitions to say, well, this is exactly what we told you to do. We were really precise in what we said, and yet you haven't done it. And the players are kind of caught in between of like, okay, I've got, yes, they were clear, or it seems like they were clear. The game unfolded as it unfolded, and now I'm being scrutinized of the fact that they said they were clear and I haven't done what they told me to do. And so I definitely felt for the players at times, because they're kind of caught between these two sides. I guess I described it in the thesis as like the playbook became like the official arbitrator, that actually you're being condemned on the sense that you didn't meet what the expectation was, and we were really clear in what we said, but actually it is clear in a sense. It seems that it's clear, but when you think about it within the complexity and the details of performance, it's not clear at all.
And to take that even further again, we can think about the sites in which that happens. So we started the pod by talking a little bit around performance analysis. And so the playbook being the arbiter also aligns to how the coaches and the players are actually talking about the practice themselves as well. I think I can't remember which section it's in, but one of the extracts in the thesis talks around two players talking around like deconstructing some video, and one of them deconstructs it in this really like fluid way where they use the language of the playbook, and they ascribe the language to the right actions, as they come across really impressive and they get deemed as being like they know exactly what they're doing. The next person uses the right language, but not then, or not there, or not that. It's not that we're referring to. And this kind of contextual, right, well, it wasn't that action. Okay, you've got the right playbook language here, but you've not ascribed it to the right action, and therefore being deemed as not being able to talk in a way that was demonstrating understanding. And so you can see how some of the findings actually overlap there in the way that actually in the way you can comprehend how meaning was being ascribed and done and achieved by the participants.
And how learning is happening, I suppose, to a certain point. I mean, what you're describing to me there just sounds vividly like Vygotsky's ideas of imitation. You know, they've got to pick up the language slowly over time, and they might use the language, but in the wrong context, or, you know, the not there, not that, etc. You know, how much of this was about you trying to look for kind of how they were learning the language, or was your interpretation of, okay, they've attached some meaning to it, that was learning for you? Or
I guess it's probably a good opportunity to move on to the next theme, because this definitely talks to some of those sentiments. I guess to begin with, a description of what it is that I'm talking about, and then we'll come back onto that. So the second subheading theme that I've discussed in my results is what the club actually claimed as their commonality of language. It's similar to the playbook in that it tries to define a series of actions to use as commands on the field in order to instruct what players do. The focus is less so with coordinating a larger group, but is more finite in terms of specific actions. Of course, between various different contexts, regions, countries, even between clubs, you can talk about a single movement, an action, but they often use different terms to refer to that particular action. And so what the club, of course, tried to do is like, right, we need to be on the same page here. When the game is as fast-paced as it is, we need to make sure everybody kind of understands what different things are. And so, for instance, a short pass to somebody's left or right can be referred to as a pop in some areas, in others to a kind of tip, which is what they refer to it at the club. So similar instances such as that, types of pass, types of movement, so cuts or different movements such as that as an offence, when to squeeze within a ruck, for instance, they all have different terminology. So they created what they call commonality of language, or a glossary of such, for that particular reason, that they wanted to be able to make sure that they're on the same pitch. But the kind of backlash of that is that this language, this commonality of language that they came to use, almost came as a way of players to demonstrate that they understood things. It's what it felt like, that players were trying to make sure that when they were articulating performance in player review sessions, and particularly in meetings, that, hey, look, coaches, I can use some of this language that you've told us to use. And so it almost felt as if it became a kind of demonstration that I know, I know what it is that you're talking about. I'm able to use that language in a certain way. And I guess it's the sentiments of Vygotsky's imitation here, that, okay, I've seen the coaches use that under the circumstances of which it should be used. Now I'm going to try and use it in the same way to make sense of the video, whatever it is that we're doing. More importantly, of course, that I'm able to use it on the field, that we can refer to these terms in a kind of consistent, standardized mode, so that we can make sure we're coordinated in what we do. Charlie picked up earlier about that specific instance between two contrasting instances of that, and it was actually within the same team meeting, that there was one of the players who was kind of up-and-coming player, who was quite young but has been recognised as somebody with good potential. And straight away, he was able to use that in a really effective way, so to speak, that he was able to make sense of performance, pick up on certain things. I've actually got a bit of data that I'll just articulate. So he says, we go through the phases well here: get from the edge, change lanes, hit up through the middle. So get up to the edge and change lanes are all terms that the coaches want the players to use. They refer to specific instances within the game. He's kind of looking between the coaches, the video, to kind of get a nod of approval that what he's doing is correct. He said, we lose the race to the ruck. Owen has to come fire through here, and the pack is still recovering from the last ruck on the edge. So we need to secure this ball, but he comes in from the side and gives the penalty away. As the player was discussing that, I then looked towards some of the coaches, and actually one of the coaches was sat next to me, and I could just see his head nodding the whole time. And he actually gives me a nudge on the shoulder, and he says, he's got a good rugby head, he has. And so you can kind of see that kind of nod to a kind of capable student, that he got it. And all of the terms that I was referring to there kind of fell under this glossary. So when we talk about fire through, we talk about change lanes, get to the edge. When we talk about another one, secure this ball, for instance. They're all the kind of terms that the coaches were looking for players to use, and he used it very competently, and it kind of gave a good impression that he understood. The contrast to that then was that another player was kind of using terms in a very similar way, but it felt like he was just using them or just throwing them out there to kind of satisfy the needs of the task. And although much of what he was referring to actually described instances, or at least the terms that we were using were reflective of the actions that they were supposed to reflect, they weren't necessarily using quite a meaningful way to make sense of what it was that they were doing. And it eventually led one of the coaches to say, well, what is it you're actually trying to say here? What's the point that you're trying to get across? And at that point, the player just came out with more of this, just threw more of that language at them. So he said, well, we just need to get more gold standard set pieces and get into our red shape quicker. And it didn't really sync with the coaches. It didn't really grasp what it was that they were trying to get hold of. And so it just shows that actually this language that we think is used to instruct as kind of commands, as things that we have on the field, has a kind of twofold purpose here, that it's actually right. Are you making sense of what it is that we're trying to portray here? Are you able to see the game in a similar sense to what we are?
I think that really speaks to just kind of extending that in more general sense. As I'm listening to you speak, Dan, I'm thinking about some of my own practice as well, where you have a group of players in front of you and you maybe ask a question, what did we do well there? What did we not do so well? And there's a couple of things that kind of that are spilling out in the way that you're explaining that. Some of the tensions around the question in and of itself is not a neutral question. The language that you're expecting and that you're drawing upon, again, there's some expectation around how we should speak around that practice. And there's also kind of a bedazzlement around those who can speak about the game and those who can't speak about the game. I'm thinking about football, for instance. Stereotypical accusation of football is that they're not very articulate, and those who are articulate then get ascribed as being, they'll be a good manager when the time comes. And really, what we're highlighting here is how some of the mystification behind that, some of the misplaced assumptions around it, that talking about the game and doing the game are two different things, and they can be sometimes merged together in a way that can be unhelpful. And there's also part of the job of the coach is actually to merge them together in a way that it becomes really helpful. And this is a real tension, I think, that comes out of what Dan has just mentioned, and it speaks to much of the content of the podcast, of the degree, of the research that we've done. It's a really fundamental point that we're raising here, which is fascinating. Listen back to it as well.
It's interesting. The coaches are basically presenting the playbook and the glossary as such as being something that's going to be really kind of, it is ultimately reproductive, but it's very generative for them in terms of, I know players are going to be pretty much close to the right place and they're going to do almost as I want them to do, I suppose. But is that not just hyper restrictive also at the same time? Is there not a need necessarily to allow players that wiggle room on things?
I think it's inevitable because we've got 15 players on a pitch that we need to try to coordinate. And so you have to do that. I'm not, in no way am I trying to do away with these ideas. The point that I'm trying to get across, really, I suppose, is that you need to be careful about how these terms come to be explained. What's restrictive is the definition that we have to stick to this absolute sense of this is what it is in a kind of social vacuum. That's how the definition was generally portrayed, and that's then therefore how the proposed actions are portrayed. I guess the point to get across is that this is a kind of vague criteria of what we mean by this. You have to respond to the contextual details of what's going on, and we have to practice it under many different conditions. It's no good, as you see quite a lot within rugby more broadly, and within some respects in football as well, and other team sports, I suppose. We practice these nice, neat patterns, unopposed a lot of the time, sometimes with opposition, but we need to practice them under different scenarios, against a high press within football, within hockey, for instance, against a drift defence in rugby, at different phases of the game, at different phases of the field. That's where you get a more kind of collective sense of what this means under different circumstances. So that, I think that's a definite point to get across, is that the method of explanation is really taken for granted here, but it's really important.
Did the team try to create all those different scenarios then in training, or was it ultimately about team performance and then try and sort of take some sort of learning from applying those understandings against a particular concept?
There was definitely gameplay opportunities, and that's integral to really get a clear sense of, but I feel it could be maximized a bit more. To do these things in isolation. You're also constrained, of course, by the amount of time they have with players, and they have to get their point across really quickly, which might be indicative of that method of explanation as well. But definitely, we talk about game-based activities, but it's understanding what these terms, these calls are within the game is really important.
Yeah, I think, again, just thinking more generally about it, we see a lot in football where you have managers or coaches who their reputation is based upon a particular playing style. They get their teams to play in a particular way. And in many ways, in some of the coach education that I've been through myself, you get advocated, how do you want your team to play? What are some of the details in which you want your team to play? What formation will you implement? These kind of questions that actually speak to a lot of what Dan's highlighted here around a playbook. This somewhat detached explanation of how teams should play, and coaches they have earned huge livings off of being able to articulate, well, this is how my team is going to play. And then what we actually see, there's numerous examples that we can then pull out, is the tension of that unfolding. Okay, well, here's how I would like my team to play, and then the actual team that they get hold of either thriving under that or really struggling with it, or going well and not going so well in other weeks. And again, that really speaks to this tension that we're referring to, the productive nature of having an explanation of how we're going to play, of trying to stitch people together, but also recognizing that you are not going to be able to get everyone to do the same thing. You're not going to be able, you have multiple people playing together against other people, and so it's not a possibility, and this tension arises between explanation and action, and how do you generate meaning, and what's going to be purposeful here moving forward, and how do you do that repeatedly as well? How do you get that outcome, even though you might change some of the opposition, you might change some of the scenarios you're in, but you're still able to find solutions? And it really speaks to kind of the particularities of coaching, the uniqueness of it. It's what makes it so difficult as well.
You could just got me thinking about the fact that players that come to university, I've only got hold of them for 3, maybe 4 years if I'm lucky, but I find myself probably spending at least the first year actually trying to break down or trying to make sense of the language that they currently use when they come to the university to talk about certain things. And I'm trying to almost rip it apart and then almost install a new language, install a new way of thinking about the game. It's so tough when you've got, I don't know, we've got 80 members in the tennis club. I only have to look after sort of 15 to 20 of them at any one time. But that's a lot of people to try and understand how they use their, how they talk about the game of tennis in their own unique way, and then try and think about where my language is almost going to fit in between and over the top of that kind of stuff to help them most. Really, really challenging. I think that was probably one of the key takeaways, was just making me think a little bit about, well, how is it that I go about identifying that language in the first place? What questions do I ask? What do I look for? And then the part that I'm still battling with, in fairness, and will continue to battle with, but is how do I see that understanding in a game form, in terms of if I give them an idea or if I ask them to play a game with a particular word in their mind, what does that look like for this player versus what does that look like for someone else? It's so tough, really tough. So I think some really important messaging there. We're coming up to around about an hour. We've still got one more finding to go. So let's jump into that, just so we're not taking too much of your time. Craft language, or the language of craft, is presented in the thesis. Tell us a little bit about that one to lead us into the end. Yeah,
so I guess this is where we're making the distinction between different forms of speaking, want of a better phrase, really. The playbook, the commonality of language, its glossary, were very much developed, explained, defined, and endorsed by coaches in a kind of top-down fashion. This is the vocabulary that we want you to use. These are the kind of commands that we want you to use in order to play the game, but also to make sense of the game, to discuss the game. The craft language in that sense was much more bottom up. It was kind of the familiar lexicon that players already have, the kind of, that's why I've referred to it or used the metaphor of a craft, kind of articulated a certain expertise about what players ordinarily do. The kind of features of very common rugby language that featured without players really thinking about it, but coming from an outsider's perspective. And I guess this was the value of not having such familiarity with the sport. It was really impressive sometimes to hear them talk about the game in the way that they were. I've got a few examples. First of all, one of the coaches discussing through a bit of footage. So there a footage played, and it showed them in defence. They're in possession of the ball, and eventually the ball gets passed along the string of players, and then they get pushed out of touch at the end. And so the coach is questioning some of the players or what they were doing during that process. He said, "We're not blocking lines, are we? We're making our dumming runs, which is great, but we're letting the defence drift and show us into touch. It's far too easy for them. We've got to be better at disrupting them as we move across and not let them dictate the direction of the attack. You've got to be cute about it, though. You can't afford just to smash players out the way. Make your dummy run, check for the line of defender at the corner of your eyes, and then stop them from pushing you across." And this is where some of the craft language comes in. He said, "Look, if we do that, we create a gap here and an overload out wide. And then if we do that, look, we've got 1, 2, 3 options for a walk-in." And so some of that really kind of, I guess, familiar language that they were using just helped to explicate some of the other more formalized terms that they were using. It really felt a more familiar way that they were able to discuss the game. Some of the players had a similar example, and I think this one is really indicative of what I mean by this then. So they were actually talking through one of the playbook calls, and in this case, a line out, and they were really trying to figure out, okay, how can we make this happen? What is it that we can do as players, having reviewing a certain bit of footage to make sure that we can get the ball out to where it needs to be? So one of the players says, "Bertie, come here, mate. Take a look at this." And the footage is playing. He says, "If you plug here," pointing to the screen, "then we can secure this ball and get a cleaner ball out to Robbo," which is one of the other players. He says, "I'm not sure if I could, to be honest, mate, because I'm the wrong side of the setup and won't be able to get through." He says, "Look, you can, mate. If you open your body a bit, then once you're in that setup, you can roll inside and then we can plug that gap. And I reckon we can do that." And so it was these small terms that I was starting to pick up on that I just thought, like ideas of plug or rolling inside, cleaner ball, for instance, that out of the context of that specific rugby environment, that situation would make no sense whatsoever. And it was something actually right at the beginning of the field work, I honestly felt like I was listening to a different language, it was foreign. It could have been speaking Spanish at some point. When you're involved in that sport, you don't really think about it at all. And this is kind of the taken for granted aspect of it. But it was just really impressive to see how they were talking and describing about the game outside of this more formalized talk, this more formalized vocabulary that coaches were trying to not enforce, but trying to make sure the players were using.
The context then, like the rugby context, is what gives the language the sort of the meaning then? Or is it that these terms sort of I don't know, they get exchanged back and forth and they eventually narrow it down to a particular word that sort of best fits what they're trying to describe? I
guess that's the idea. That at no point during the field work was there ever a discussion, okay, what do we mean by this term? There was never an explicit, right, this is the definition of plug. This is what we mean by roll inside. And this is what I mean by it being more bottom up. It's kind of emergent. As people become better or perhaps more involved, more familiar with the game of rugby, they pick up on these terms as it is. And so I guess the point of the argument here, and this is what we mean by the difference between bottom up and top down, is that you don't necessarily always need this is the definition, because it becomes much more emergent about kind of the things that we're doing in the game and the discussions that surround it.
I think one of the things that I'd add to that is there's a really nice explanation, like top down, bottom up. We're not advocating an either or here. Definitely not advocating an either or, particularly around this sense of more clarity, more detail. I think that's often an urge that you get ascribed, give me a little bit more detail here. Can you explain that in more detail? Those kind of sentiments. And actually one thing that's really interesting is one thing I'd like to add in is around glossing practices. So Dan mentioned it earlier around the glossary of terms, but there's this idea around glossing practices that has some relevance here, that actually you can only say so much when you say something, and you know, requiring more detail doesn't actually provide you any more clarity. So if I offer an example, if you say your partner Mike goes down to the shop, and you say, right, can you get me milk, bread and eggs? When your partner goes into the shop, they are able to identify what milk, even though they're not necessarily clarified what colour top that might be. Yeah, the eggs or how many, they're able to step into that space and work out, right, how many eggs, which egg should I go for, what cost should I then go for it. Same with the bread, you know, white, brown bread, multi-grain, all these variety of options, all these details. And I suppose the craft language in that sense is really trying to highlight some of that detail in, or we have a gloss set of terms, you know, we were looking to attack with speed. If it's quite a general term, or we're going to try and play patiently, or we're going to try and dominate the game. These kind of general terms, gloss terms, but actually they have lots of sense and meaning that the members are able to then make sense of as they go along. And so they're gloss terms, but they're incredibly rich. And I think the final point that Dan's making there around the craft language really highlights the way in which the participants were able to express some of that richness of language, how they're then able to really work through that. I think the fact in that instance as well, where the two players, they're debating it in some sense. They're trying to iron out, well, what the richness was and how certain details and certain movements might allow for a different set of options. Again, all of which couldn't just be explained through providing more detail in the playbook in the first place. So it's not an either or, but actually it's trying to accept some of the ambiguity and embrace it, but also allow for space and time for the richness of those conversations to explore it. And I think that's a really fascinating part of it.
How much of this needs the care of trying, as a coach, I'm thinking here, not to almost over intervene on those words, those bottom up words that just sort of seem to exist and sort of float around, and they help to provide that little bit of support or meaning for the players. But then, like, we want to try and control as much as possible, or there's that temptation to try and control quite a lot. If you hear that word plug, you're like, okay, what do you mean by plug? And then all of a sudden becomes this really explicit, really conscious thing. And then players are almost thinking too deeply about that particular thing that you're trying to do, and they overthink it and they add too much of a definition. And how much care needs to be taken here with sort of trying to recognize those little words and actually deciding, okay, I need to hash that one out a little bit versus, do you know what, I'm going to leave that one because I think that one's going to be quite helpful. I
guess there's a difference in the purpose of the different terminology that we've talked about so far. Is that the formalized top-down ideas playbook are kind of introducing new movements, new formations, things that we haven't necessarily done previously, and so there has to be some form of explanation, definition, whereas these more craft ideas are the more familiar aspects of their game already. There's a great sense. They haven't ever needed to be introduced to a definition because they have a clear sense of what that refers to. And that just becomes from being environments where that word's been used before to refer to those specific instances. That's where the meaning comes from. I guess this is where they start to join a little bit, is that's the position you want to get to with some of these more formalized words, that we don't need to start or have an in-depth discussion around what these terms mean, because there is that sense, there's that familiarity, and that just becomes with greater use of the term. It's no coincidence, I don't think, that we think about teams, they're good because they've been together for a long period of time, because they have that shared sense of what it is expected in certain situations to do certain aspects of the game, and they have a clear tactical setup that they have a very clear sense because they've used it and done it very many times.
Yeah, you've got me literally thinking of a game that I was playing with the boys on Thursday evening last week. A lot of pressure on the returner, and I said, you need to try and basically extend the rally as long as possible, get through the first 4 or 5 shots until the advantage of the servers disappeared. And I just said, I just want you to survive the first 3 or 4 balls. Well, I didn't need to tell them that means opening up the racket face and nudging the ball around a little bit and aiming for the cross courts and the big targets and things like that. I just said, just survive the first 3 or 4 balls. And it totally changed the way that they actually performed within those first few shots of the rally. So that I guess that's probably one of these sort of, these glossy terms that's There's enough meaning there that I can throw it out there, and I doesn't need that extra explanation to it.
And I think one thing that I would emphasize is that you need those gloss terms. You need gloss terms because you can't always expect infinite detail. Because like I said, it's infinite detail. You can always keep going with more detail, more. You could bring the body into it. You can bring lots of different features of your instruction forward, but it doesn't mean more equals better. And in fact, actually, that's where the beauty of the project. That's what it speaks to. That actually being able to try and develop a hunch for, okay, I need to be clear here. I need to think about my how I'm going to define, to explain, instruct in these particular instances. And then also thinking about, okay, I'm going to let this one, I'm going to let this go. I'm going to allow the players to speak in this particular way. What are the things that are going to be hard on? What are the things you're not going to be hard on? What are the actions that you're going to reinforce, and what are the actions that actually you think are more negotiable, and how you're going to stitch those people together? And that's where the real difficulty of coaching comes in. And irrespective of whether you're doing a team sport where you times it by 15 in rugby, or whether you're 1-to-1 in tennis, you're still playing against an opponent who is variable, and they're going to move. And it's the same even for much more closed sports as well. The situations arise and certain features unfold that you have to try and get a grip of, and that's what this really speaks to. And it really comes out in the way in which we treat language, and maybe the misassumptions that we have around language that actually exaggerate these issues, as opposed to really clarify what it is that you're trying to do as a coach. And then consequently, how can you then make informed decisions around what you're doing in your coaching practice?
It's great. I know, we've talked about a fair few implications on the way through those findings there. So I know people that are listening to the podcast, any kind of practitioner, coach, teacher, they're going to take a lot from that. So thank you for sharing those. Just one more question about the thesis, and then I'll let you do some ranting and some myth busting. You've developed quite an interest in philosophy, especially since your time starting the DSc, and that's only grown over the past few years. It's very apparent in this thesis how that's sort of shining through. What is it about philosophy that you've been drawn to, and why is it you sort of hanging your hat on that a little bit as being something that's going to be really positive for coaching research?
Yeah, I mean, a very humble understanding of philosophy so far. It's only something I've been looking into for a few years, and wow, there's a lot to take in, let me say. But I guess the point to make is that running through many of the discussions that we've had today are very complex philosophical arguments, understanding around the kind of the nature of the concepts that we're talking about. So getting clear on the role of language, what language does, the nature of meaning, around related ideas such as instructions, how that relates to action. And there's a kind of swirling of concepts here, which we often treat as kind of empirical investigations, that we need to go out and find evidence for the way that these things interact or occur. And actually, the kind of Wittgensteinian argument here is getting clear on those concepts will help eradicate some of the confusions that we've got. So we might think of a particular instance, let's say, is how is it that the instruction that I give is internalized through some process in the brain that then produces an action? That is a kind of confusion which comes from the way we come to describe those things, that something is internalized, that a brain process occurs, that an action then follows. Whereas if we have clarification on what we mean by instruction and kind of the relationship that has to action, that empirical argument, that kind of the need to go away and find evidence for something will disappear. And so that's really the role, without becoming too abstract here, that's really the role of what philosophy can perhaps offer. Chris Hughes has got an interesting paper in one of the specialisms in SCR, which starts to touch on that, kind of advocating the role of conceptual analysis in favour of some more empirical forms of research, which has become really prevalent within what we would call, I guess, the sociology of sport coaching.
Perfect. So, myth busting then. You come prepared for us this afternoon. Most of our guests, they turn up and they're like, oh, I'm going to have to think of something here. But you've got one written down on a sheet of paper already. So you've got a couple of minutes. You can rant away.
It comes back to, I guess, where we started the podcast, really, in thinking about performance analysis, having experienced being an analyst to some limited extent, but really trying to understand, okay, what does analysis mean for sport coaching? I get frustrated with the, perpetual need for stats, and that everything refers back to, look at the stats. What are the stats saying? What does that mean for me? To the point where players or sports performers, even in some of the interviews that they have post-game, is need to get my stats up, or my stats are looking good recently. Much of the conversations where you think about in the media, within some of the sports coverage or the broadcasting, they're always referring to the stats as to how well the game was played or not, and trying to make sense of the game thereafter. But I guess the point I want to get across is that stats is just one way of looking at a game. And sometimes it can be quite a limited game, because stats can only capture certain aspects, the things that people perceive to be measurable. Very finite features of skills often: shots on target, possession, passes completed. There's a new fad within football, such as expected goals, which we'll get stuck into another time perhaps. And so actually stats aren't necessarily the true description of what occurred, as they sometimes come perceived to be, but are just a perspective. And sometimes quite a limited perspective, because I can't measure, for instance, specifically, let's say, my positioning here to prevent a run or a ball being passed through here. Or I can't necessarily think about how a collective sense of three were able to create a shape that stopped somebody advancing up the field. They're things that when you turn to an analyst, say, well, you can't measure that. But that's a real key aspect of what coaches and players are looking for. So I'm not trying to say, again, as with other features of what we've discussed today, to do away with these things, but just have a caution when looking at them, when thinking about them, to say, okay, yes, that's a view. That is, and it's an important view a lot of the time. We can often gain a lot from it, but it is just a view.
All the time with like player selection, they send us their world tennis numbers or their ratings and things, and you look at it and you go, okay, that looks like a good number, and then I suppose the reality, the playing reality, is something that you kind of like, oh, it's not what I thought it was going to look like. And there's so many different ways of playing the game. I'm talking from tennis perspective here, but of course across all the other sports, stats will only really get you so far. You've got to go and see it and be involved in it, I think, to get a real feel for it. And this is someone like you coming with a with a master's in performance analysis and maybe exercising a little bit of caution there. So I think that's a really good one. That's probably one of the best myths we've had dispelled, I think, on the podcast thus far. So hopefully people can we'll take sides with you there on that one. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Massive thank you to Dan and Charlie for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your work. And of course, thank you to everyone from the Sport Broadcast team, especially Alex, for supporting us with the podcast today. We'll be back very soon for another episode. But in the meantime, make sure you leave us a rating, subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media.
All the links to our social medias are in the podcast description below.